Welcome to State of Play. I'm Will Todman, Chief of Staff of the Geopolitics and Foreign Policy Department at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. In this podcast, we bring together our leading experts to unpack the latest geopolitical developments from around the world and what it all means. Last weekend, a group of 10 world leaders posed for a photo in front of Sugarloaf Mountain in Rio de Janeiro. This was the meeting of BRICS+. So that's Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and then the 5 new members, Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, Indonesia, and the UAE. And they condemned Trump's tariffs, they condemned strikes on Iran, and they also condemned NATO members' increased defense spending. They didn't listen to Max last week saying he didn't want anyone to talk about 5%. And this is a powerful group and a growing group. They have 40% of the global economy and 55% of the global population. And it's long been described as a rival grouping to the US-led world order. But I think maybe the smiles in that photo masked the fact that perhaps the Rio summit didn't go quite to plan. Firstly, several of the leaders skipped it. So we had no Putin, no Sisi of Egypt, no Pezeshkian of Iran. But the most significant absence, I think, was China's. This was the first time that President Xi had skipped it since he took power. And then we see some signs of growing tensions as well. Russia's invasion of Ukraine is still looming over it. There are, important differences between the authoritarian members and the democratic members. And they certainly have some different strategies of how to deal with President Trump. So today, we are here to explore if BRICS Plus is still central to China's rival world order. Is this group able to be a serious counterweight to the G7? Or is China now adopting an alternative strategy for competing with the US, particularly in places like Latin America? So we have 2 new voices for State of Play today. Firstly, Dr. Ryan Berg is director of our Americas program. So Ryan, as well as having done extensive work on China's role in Latin America, you are particularly well placed to discuss this summit, as I believe you used to live in Brazil. Were you in Rio, where this was?
I was not. I lived in Florianópolis, which is a city further to the south than Rio, but has very similar characteristics. It's a beach city. It's very much oriented around beaches, going to the ocean, surfing, these kinds of things. Okay.
So, Ryan, what would be your advice to these world leaders who were visiting Brazil? What should they have eaten while they were there?
Well, I'll focus on the Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, who represented Russia. If he had looked out the window, which it should be noted are much safer in Brazil than they are in his own country of Russia. If he had looked out the window, perhaps even opened the window, but just to look out, he would have seen a lot of Brazilians enjoying their time on the beach and eating a very famous stew, in fact, the national dish called feijoada, which is a stew that's made of beans as well as usually a piece of pork, and it's served a lot of times on top of rice. So feijoada carioca, which is the typical Rio version thereof, is a delicious dish, and usually people top it off with what's called the chopp, which is a very light beer that you can drink under any circumstance, including heavy sun. In Brazil. So hopefully he enjoyed that.
Yeah, let's hope. Thank you. Henrietta Levin is a senior fellow in the Freeman Chair in China Studies. Henrietta, you come to CSIS after a career in US government spanning different administrations, different agencies and departments, the White House, State, DOD. I'm guessing maybe some of the advice you might have for the members is how to deal with jet lag and very short international trips. Thank you so much for joining us. Okay, let's get straight into it. And I want to start with you, Ryan, and talk about President Lula of Brazil and what his plan was for the summit. What do you think Lula was hoping to get out of this summit?
It's a great question, Will. I think if you're Lula from Brazil, you participate in the BRICS year in and year out because it guarantees you meetings with your Chinese counterparts, with your Russian counterparts, with your Indian counterparts, probably to a lesser extent with your South African counterparts. This is before the expansion. So every country, I think, has found their own reason for continuing to participate in BRICS. That's Brazil's. It guarantees them meetings with middle powers on the global stage and with China that they want to have every single year. And it guarantees them meetings at the foreign minister level and at the president's level. And I must imagine that this year, when Brazil was hosting, with so few leaders actually coming to Rio, that must have been a great disappointment to Lula. Nevertheless, I think in the meetings, he tried to put on a good face and really project BRICS as a new way of doing business in the international space. He kept saying that BRICS is a new way of doing politics. It's focused around multilateralism. It's focused around democratizing international affairs. That's something that you hear come up quite often at BRICS meetings, by which most countries mean just greater participation of more members. And for Brazil, this is really a point of pride, a point of prestige for them, that they are the B in BRICS, not just an original member, but they're the first letter in the acronym.
Which I think someone at Goldman Sachs came up with BRICS or something
We're
like that.
talking about a paper that was produced in the early 2000s by Jim O'Neill. This was never meant to be an organization. And nevertheless, here we are. And in fact, he's actually said that it was never meant to be an organization. And I think he's even said it's kind of stupid that it's an organization.
I don't know if there's hope for us there or a warning for us there, that if we put something in a paper, who knows where it might go in the future. So Henrietta, why did she skip it? Why didn't he come?
Well, firstly, thank you for having me. And it's an interesting question. Of course, we don't know. We probably won't know exactly what the answer is. But I think there's a few factors we can consider. There is the fact that India had a state visit on the side of the summit. If we think back to summits she has skipped that he's traditionally gone to, I mean, the one that comes to mind for me is G20 in India. And there is an ongoing rivalry, if a slightly tempered one, between China and India. It could be possible that she didn't want to look upstaged.
So this was a Brazil-India state visit on the sidelines of this BRICS summit?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. It might have been that, she was concerned this would look like Modi's moment on the world stage. And if there's one thing the Chinese system will not allow to happen, as I have been told many times, it is anything that would affect President Xi's political dignity. You hear a lot about Xi's political dignity in my line of work. But it's possible this is a much more kind of mundane, less of a strategic question. Li Qiang, the premier, did attend and participate fulsomely in the BRICS summit. Traditionally between the Chinese president and the premier, they divide up kind of the summit circuit. So, for example, for the ASEAN meetings, the East Asia Summit annually, the premier goes. The premier has, as far as I know, always gone. It's his job to go. And he is seen as the leader representing China in what is admittedly a bit of a vestigial view of the Chinese system of government, where now she is in such an undisputed way the leader. The president, she is the leader of China, and everyone else is effectively a functionary. But at the same time, I think that, as she continues through his third term, he is starting to place greater trust in some of his handpicked lieutenants, including the premier, including Li Qiang. So I would not see this as an indication that China is necessarily downgrading its strategic vision of BRICS at all. But rather that she believes Li Qiang can do this for him, for the country. It's also worth saying that, President Xi was just in Brazil in November for the G20 summit, and also just hosted the leaders of the Latin American region in Beijing for a regional summit just back in May. And in both of those engagements held side meetings in some depth with Lula. So he's put in his time. The two have seen a lot of each other over the last... They've spent a lot of...
And there was another state visit in April of 2023, if I'm not mistaken. So first, Lula, in his third term now, made his first international trip to the United States, a couple days here in Washington, and then went immediately to China afterwards and spent about a week there, Shanghai and Beijing. And so that when he had his most recent state visit after the China CELAC summit in May, that was the third time in Lula's third term that the two of them have spent considerable time together. So they see each other a ton. And though Lula is probably disappointed she didn't come to Rio, it's not because of lack of connection between the two leaders.
Okay. I should be careful not to try and make every episode about the Middle East. But since there was just a war in Iran, between Iran and Israel, and Iran is obviously a member of BRICS, to what degree did that shape this and kind of undermine the plans that Lula had for what this would focus on? As you said, Ryan, talking about multilateralism and whatnot. Was it all just about Iran then? Or was he able to make it, to keep on track and prevent that from dominating?
That was certainly the big fear going into this meeting from the Brazilians and from others, in fact, that the BRICS would be overtaken by statements, fiery, passionate statements about what's going on in Iran, feeling the need to come to Iran's aid. And in fact, I think after BRICS, I think Iran looks just as isolated, if not even more isolated than it did before, because the statement, as you mentioned in the intro, of course, has a little bit about Iran in it, but the meeting was not exclusively about Iran at all. And the Brazilians had asked Iran to downplay that aspect of their attendance at the BRICS because they wanted to accomplish this important show of multilateralism. They wanted to talk about AI. They wanted to talk about climate governance because, of course, they hope to host the COP30 later this year in Belém, a northern city in Brazil. They wanted to talk about other things than just Iran. And I think merely from the statement and also from the parts of the meetings that I've observed, they've managed to succeed in that endeavor.
It must have been a slightly awkward conversation. Like, sorry, we know you've just been bombed by Israel and the US, but just forget about it for now because we have other plans. So I want to understand the sort of how the fact that Brazil was hosting this shapes the outcomes. So at the start, I mentioned, that there are authoritarian members, there are democratic members of this grouping of BRICS plus. Did the absence of Xi and Putin in particular mean that there was a sort of a tilt towards the democracy piece of this, maybe the multilateralism that you mentioned, Ryan? Or as you said, Henrietta, there were other very capable deputies there who were still able to represent the Chinese view and the Russian view. Sergei Lavrov attended on behalf of Russia. So did this not really change the balance between authoritarian and democratic?
Well, one thing I always look for coming out of any summit that China is participating in is whether they were able to get their signature initiatives into the joint statement. So this includes President Xi's Global Security Initiative, Global Development Initiative, Global Civilization Initiative, perhaps most ominously. And so these ideas for global order, which are admittedly ill-defined, but no less important to Xi for that, have become really top policy priorities in these diplomatic engagement for the Chinese side. And so it was interesting to me that, these initiatives, GDI, GCI, GSI, were nowhere in the 30-something page declaration coming out of the summit. And, there's a number of reasons that could be the case. I mean, there's always an India factor, and India has, a good deal of concern about what these initiatives may mean and kind of wondering whether the lack of definition, in fact, empowers China to decide what they are after you've already agreed to them in a way that could be problematic. I don't know if I could credit Brazil with the lack of support for those initiatives, for the lack of support explicitly, at least, for China's model of global governance, because, in the joint statements that we see between Lula and Xi, those initiatives are all over the place. And Brazil, even though they have refrained from, formally joining the Belt and Road Initiative, they've been very comfortable kind of signing up to this idea of global governance. So it's interesting to see how that plays out, but we won't know what happened exactly behind the scenes.
I think a lot of these statements are oftentimes worked out well in advance of the actual meetings themselves. So if you were to look temporally at what transpired on the 6th and the 7th of July, by the evening of the 6th, we had already seen some drafts of the final statement circulating online. And so clearly, it's not that in a matter of hours they came up with 40 paragraphs of agreement. These were agreements that were, or the communique rather, the points in there were agreed to in advance, or for the most part agreed to in advance, which allows China, Russia, Iran countries that didn't have the full representation of their top-level leadership at the meeting to still, nevertheless, get some of their points into the statement. While China may not have gotten some of these key initiatives in, I look, for example, to Russia and to Iran. Iran, of course, got its statement condemning the attack, and Russia got important agreement on several paragraphs regarding Ukrainian attacks on Russian infrastructure. So nothing about the Russian aggression in Ukraine, nothing condemning the initial invasion in 2022, but a condemnation of Ukrainian retaliatory strikes on Russian infrastructure in Russia, which I found quite interesting. And then one point on multilateralism, because I think it's a broad enough term that both the sort of Russian and Chinese interpretation, the authoritarian interpretation, and the India, South Africa, Brazil interpretation of it can coexist. So for the democratic group that you've referred to, Will, it's about reform to global governance institutions. It's not about presenting alternatives to those. So it's about getting that seat if you're Brazil, the North Star of your foreign policy. It's about getting that seat on the UN Security Council. For India, for South Africa, these are important objectives as well. Maybe if you're Russia or if you're China, you're more revisionist about what you think should happen to the global order. I don't consider Brazil to be a revisionist power. It's asking for more inclusion, but not necessarily revision of how the order works. But under the guise of multilateralism, enough of that can fit that you can have this kind of uneasy coexistence between authoritarians and democratic powers in the BRICS.
So I want to bring this back to the question I raised at the start and sort of how central is BRICS, or BRICS Plus, I should say, to China's global strategy and to its strategy more specifically of coming up with an alternative or a rival to the US-dominated order. And so how do you see, Henrietta, how do you see BRICS fitting into that much more broadly? Is particularly given what China's trying to do with Europe and trying to get Europe on side, is BRICS now less important or a bit more awkward as a kind of venue or a partner for shaping that role?
Sure. So I think that BRICS is still an important part of the tapestry of world order that Beijing is seeking to bolster and ultimately lead. But it is part of a much broader tapestry of organizations led by or increasingly led by China. Of course, we have the SCO Summit, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, coming up, which will be hosted in China this fall. We saw the CELAC China, the China-Latin America Summit in May, and a number of other kind of China plus region summits. She went to Kazakhstan for an important Central Asia summit. So you see how the blocks start to fit together into something that feels increasingly like, I think in China's mind, a viable world order. I think that sometimes the importance of BRICS itself to that project is slightly overstated. I think Ryan had a really important point at the top of the value of BRICS as a diplomatic venue. It does matter who these leaders spend their time talking to, and this as a venue for engagement among countries that share a skepticism of American leadership. I mean, that matters itself in shaping the future of world order. I also think BRICS is important in some ways as an indicator. It's worth noting that Indonesia has now joined BRICS. They made that decision in 2024 after, in 2023, getting quite close to that line and ultimately making a decision to pull back and say, well, we're going to stick with ASEAN. We're going to stick with the organizations we have. And I think that the fact that Indonesia has joined, that many Southeast Asian countries have decided to become partners of BRICS, and this is a part of the world where their tagline is basically, we don't want to choose. The fact that they have so publicly chosen at least some degree of alignment with the idea of BRICS, I think shows us that China's vision of world order is gaining steam, has some level of attractive power, even if decisions taken by BRICS itself may not be the driving force of that order.
Ryan, does that mirror how Latin American countries are viewing BRICS, both Brazil and others who might want to be a part of it or who are considering whether or not to be a part of it?
I think largely it tracks. I mean, I think my view of where BRICS fits into China's overall strategy is that it's an important component of China's overall strategy to bring an order that's closer to a Beijing-led order. But it's not the most important, and it's certainly not the most important in Latin America, given that Brazil is the only full member of the BRICS, part of the organization. I think it's important to note at the 2023 Johannesburg summit, the first summit where we saw the push, largely led by China, for expansion of the BRICS, there was one Latin American country at the urging of Brazil after they realized they lost the expansion argument with China to bring a fellow Latin American country in to kind of dilute the geographic potency of BRICS as being a Horn of Africa and kind of Middle East-led expansion. And that country was Argentina. And Argentina, under Javier Milei, has decided, no thanks. We're going to align very overtly with the United States. We don't want to be part of any organization that would signal otherwise. And so that election that happened around the same time as the Johannesburg summit was really decisive for Brazil, and they remain the only full member from Latin America in the group. There are two other members that are what they call partner countries. This is an incredibly vague, frankly made up category. At the Kazan summit, the last summit that was held in Russia, there were a number of countries where, because of the way the consensus system works in the BRICS, you probably wouldn't be able to bring these countries in by consensus, but you wanted them to remain close in the orbit, let's say, of BRICS. And so they just made up this category, partner countries. It's not exactly clear what it gets you, what it doesn't, but you can be present at these summits. And there are two Latin American countries that are now considered partner countries of BRICS, and that's Cuba and Bolivia. So to the extent that those countries have come closer to BRICS, you could say it's possibly increasing the importance of BRICS for China and its role in Latin America. But I would argue, and we have argued here at CSIS, that bilateral relationships between China and countries in the region, the BRI, and other development initiatives have been far more important in terms of offering China as an alternative than the BRICS.
Just before we finish and I wrap up, as ever, we want to do these quick fire round of questions. I hope you're ready for this. So the first one is, what one word sums up this China and the BRICS summit in your mind?
Well, despite the venue and how much I spoke glowingly about Rio, I would say that the words that come to my mind are possibly forgettable.
Oh, wow. Okay.
I am going to say underwhelming.
Underwhelming and forgettable. Not great.
Not great promotion for this episode.
We won't lead with that.
Listen to an episode about an unforgettable event.
Okay. What one term would you ban pundits from using when talking about it, Henrietta?
Okay, so this is a long-standing view that applies, I think, to coverage of China in the summit, but also broader ambitions on China's part. I do not believe that the phrase amid rising tensions should be allowed in any headline for any article of news or analysis.
Okay.
Though I think it's maybe 20% of articles about China and a thing. It's amid rising tensions, comma. I don't think we need it.
Yep. Okay, great. Ryan?
I agree entirely with Henrietta. Having worked on great power competition issues for a long time, we are already in moments of tension. If you missed
tensions are here.
If you missed that news headline, you have had your head in the sand for many, many years now.
Okay, and so finally then, who is up and who is down the most this week out of the US, Russia, and China?
So I'm going to say China's up. I'm going to say that in part because she skipped the summit, because she trusted Li Qiang to do the summit. I think it will behoove China over the longer term for Xi to start re-delegating some of the foreign policy powers that he has absorbed into himself personally over the past decade or so. We don't know. This might just be a one-off decision. It may not be a trend. But if China wants to have the level of presence in the world that it has claimed to seek, it's going to need more than one person to do that.
Ryan?
I would also say China is up. The U.S., relatively speaking, is down. And one of the reasons I think is because perhaps coincidentally or perhaps not coincidentally, the U.S. is this week announcing new tariff rates for various countries that have not managed to negotiate framework agreements with the Trump administration during the 90-day pause, as well as the new date, August 1st, which will allegedly be the date on which these new tariff rates will hit.
Yeah.
That coincided with two things that I think were quite important. Well, one is the focus on unnamed countries, but clearly reference to the United States, impeding global trade. And so you have a number of protectionist countries, some communist countries, in the BRICS, all of a sudden becoming free traders. This is a point that we've sort of allowed to happen from our own policies, and I think it's in many ways been a shot in the foot. But then, as almost as if to cue my earlier point about this being potentially a forgettable episode, you have Trump almost making it a memorable episode by tweeting at late night on Sunday that any country that aligns itself with the BRICS, and it's not clear what align means in this sense, but any country that aligns itself with the BRICS would be subject to an additional 10% tariff at his discretion, almost as if to drive the point that the BRICS countries were making about impeding free trade. And so the country that used to be very much in favor of promoting trade and promoting integration for the purposes of development, including in the global south, has allowed countries that in fact are actually quite closed economies to swoop in and present themselves as guardians of a trading system that has benefited many over the last 70 or 80 years. And so for that reason, among others, I would say the US, relatively speaking, I think is down this week, and China is slightly up.
Okay, so we have a forgettable and underwhelming summit in Brazil, which was probably a disappointment to President Lula. He wanted to be pushing for more inclusion, more multilateralism, and it doesn't seem like there's been much progress on that. But then I think you have helpfully explained how BRICS is just part of this tapestry that China is building of rival global infrastructure to the US-led order. It's not the most important, but it does matter, and it matters in part because of these diplomatic engagements that happen on the sidelines. But it does seem, from what you've both said, that these bilateral ties are still more important. So we're not going to go with unforgettable as the title of this episode. Thank you to those of you who've continued to listen to the stage. But that was really...
Our listeners are going to accuse us of a bait and switch.
Yes. Yeah. Ryan, Henrietta, thanks so much for joining.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to State of Play. If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe to it wherever you heard it. And you can find more analysis at www.csis.org/geopolitics. Until next time.